Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Beck called Hyperspace. I didn't even do a full review of Beck's last album. And I wanted to, believe me. I've been a fan of Beck for years now. His genre blending combined with an uncanny knack for hooks and some ridiculously sharp songwriting has made him one of those artists that was emblematic of the mid-90s alternative scene and often praised as an innovator in the time. And yet, time hasn't really been all that kind to him. There hasn't really been a serious critical re-examination of Beck's legacy by mainstream rock critics, and I think I get why. If they did, they might come to the abrupt realization that his motley pileup of genres was more novelty and streamlined craftsmanship than genre-pushing experimentation. To quote music critic Stephen Hyden, part of his charm is that he was a jack of all trades, but a master of none. And that can be a curse years later when the genre fusions become a bit more routine and people are no longer that impressed. Or in the age of broader music distribution and access to a more of an array of underground albums that might not have been heard widely at the time, you realize that even some of Beck's genre fusions, they weren't all that innovative. Now, granted, some of this wouldn't even matter if Beck's music had aged a little better or kept up consistent quality. Yeah, Sea Change is heartbreaking, and he always tends to ring out a pretty solid single. That pop craftsmanship does a lot of work, but I'm not at all surprised that some people were really underwhelmed by Morning Phase, even if I do think it's a pretty great album with some phenomenally warm, well-blended acoustic textures. But it was also signifying that a guy who had once been framed as breaking away from the establishment was very much becoming a part of it simply because he was getting older. And Colors was sadly a glaring example of that, not helped by Greg Kurstin giving him a sound that was paradoxically kinda colorless. Hell, even leaving it on the trailing edge, I probably overrated it even then. Yes, I still like Wow despite myself for being just kooky enough in order to connect, but if you want the biggest example of how Beck is in a very different space now than he was 20 years ago, well, I'll tell you. When I saw U2 a couple years back, he was the opening act. Yeah. And thus, again, hate to say it, but I had rock bottom expectations when it came to this new album, Hyperspace. Yes, the fact that it was being co-produced by Pharrell of all people kind of intrigued me, especially as I can see some real common ground between their brands of fussy weirdness. But the last time that Pharrell strayed into oddball production outside of hip-hop proper, we got Sweetener from Ariana Grande, Wanderlust from Little Big Town, and Man of the Woods from Justin Timberlake. So yeah, with all that in mind, how's Hyperspace? Well, honestly, it is better than Colors, but not really by much. And at this point, Beck will likely wind up in the category of acts that are long past their prime, but can occasionally hit off a decent idea or a great song every once in a while. I can see him in that category for a lot of people. If you're expecting wild innovation or the ramshackle creativity we got in the 90s or even chunks of the 2000s, yeah, this is not really that, but it is pleasant enough to go down easy, and at least in comparison with that last Coldplay album, there are broad ideas that feel more developed and thoughtful, and I'll take that at least. Kind of ironic because Chris Martin himself actually supplied backing vocals to a song here, and it ultimately became one of the keys to unlocking this album and giving it a surprisingly rich organic core. It's not great, but it does grow on you. Now granted, it's also one of Beck's easiest albums to describe. Atmospheric psychedelic folk, that side of Beck, he made his Vaporwave album with the occasional splash of noisy, trap-adjacent percussion you would expect from Pharrell. And what's kind of sad is how that description makes this album seem a lot more lively or out there than it actually kind of is. In truth, there's nothing as strangely alien or magnetic as Wow on this album, or indeed any real abrasive or off-kilter tone that would compromise the blissed out haze that most of this album inhabits. And yet, I also wouldn't describe this project as explicitly psychedelic. The larger sweep of the mix and the cushion of reverb across many of these songs emphasize just how isolated and lonely Beck sounds across many of these songs. If Colors was the dance party where Beck felt ever so slightly out of place, Hyperspace is the soundtrack for that long, lonely walk home. And on some level, this isn't a bad place for Beck to be in either. It's not a bad atmosphere for him. A fusion of more acoustic elements with the normally analog, synth-heavy palette of Vaporwave and Pharrell's anxious percussion choices is, at the very least, kind of distinctive, even if you wind up thinking that many of these songs don't really transcend the atmosphere they're creating. Now, granted, I can also imagine that many people will hear Beck take this direction with Pharrell fusing in acoustic strumming with a skittering trap percussion and immediately think Man of the Woods, but the tones here seem to be a lot more reminiscent of vintage psychedelia, if not fully inhabiting that space, with a splash of the Flaming Lips and some of Beck's nervy 90s side, the latter absolutely evident in the piano melody on Saw Lightning, or the reverse melodic fragments on Die Waiting, or whenever he tries to rap, and not all that well. And that's not even to ignore the blatant Steven Wilson parallels in the minor key acoustic lines on Chemical and Stratosphere, but I should also stress that is a positive for me, especially when the richer analog synths flush out that mix and the album is given the space to really breathe, which comes through at the best on the excellent closing song Everlasting Nothing, easily the best song here. But on the flip side, when the tones don't quite mesh into the atmosphere, or the track doesn't really evolve much, you get clunkers like See-Through, or the quasi-chiptune tones of Dark Places, or the muddy but also awkwardly chintzy song Star, really kind of disappointing there. But it's also where things get a bit strange, because if you dive into the lyrics, full of oblique but straightforward references to space and disconnection, and you get the impression that the discomfort, the unease, they almost seem intentional, how there seems to be a little bit more going on in how frequently Beck questions his own senses and experiences. And it's about this time where I should mention that in the lead up to this album this year, Beck filed for divorce from his wife from over a decade and also denounced Scientology, saying that he was never really a proper member despite years of rumors otherwise. And that's when it snaps into focus. Where Sea Change might have been the breakup album with Morning Phase framed as its musical sequel, Hyperspace is very much the spiritual successor, with Beck's newfound loneliness and critical re-examination of his past relationship now in much sharper focus. When there is wistful longing like on Die Waiting, you can also tell that even then he's questioning why the hell he's even bothering to wait for her and whether or not any of it's worth it. And then following that with Chemical, where he flips the love as drug metaphor to question just how much his judgment in the relationship might have been impaired. And as his focus sharpens on songs like See-Through, as much as he might long for her on some level, the song is punctuated with lines like, I feel so ugly when you see through me. And then on the title track, he seeks dissociation from this reality, where Terrell Hines contributes the second half of the verse, and the very telling line, user needs to be intimidated, they won't know when they're invalidated. And if that doesn't sound like someone who's breaking out of cult conditioning reinforced by a relationship that could have very well been emotionally abusive, I don't know what the hell is. It's why Chris Martin's vocal contributions on Stratosphere make so much sense, given from what I remember of Ghost Stories and his split with Gwyneth Paltrow. It's why the next few songs of admiration for his ex, they're still being framed as her dragging him back towards a much darker place that he is nevertheless being kind of drawn towards on an emotional level, as he's literally referring to her as having the Queen of the Realm and the Hounds of Hell on Star. And it's also why Everlasting Nothing is so oddly exuberant and relieving as the best song here. The writing is more oblique, but it's more comfortable from Beck in his natural psychedelic state, referring to his life as a movie from which he's only now snapped awake, a great parallel to his art, and with a veiled reference to Sea Change under the prospective title once referenced by Wayne Coyne of the Flaming Lips, we do hear a moment of respite that he's finally found. Yeah, it's a little bit bleak amidst the vast, unknowable, everlasting nothing with no clear answers ahead, but there is something of a comfort in knowing that he'll find something worthwhile out there. He has before. And I gotta say it's a great closer in that moment where he breaks free. But here's the problem. For as much as I can argue that this album effectively succeeds in what it's trying to do thematically, I can't really call it a great album. Yeah, the arc makes sense, and there is a genuine emotional core I'd argue that Beck lands effectively, and it does grow on you, but it's also across an album that's kind of listless, lacking standout hooks, and featuring genre combination that I'm left thinking has more potential for greatness than what we got here. A lot of good songs, but few really great ones. I do think that Pharrell and Beck could deliver the sort of insane genre pileup of weirdness that'd be like nothing else being released right now, but it also feels like something that Beck had to release to properly break free of those heavier emotions and experiences, scattering him off to the void so he could have the creative freedom to go further in any direction. But you know what, as it is, while I say Hyperspace that it did grow on me, I'm giving it a very strong 6 out of 10 and a recommendation, but also a cautious one. In terms of Beck albums that work in this emotional space, it's not sea change, and I don't even think it's on the tier of Morning Phase, but it does play in that orbit. I can see people liking it if they like those albums from him, and right now, I only want to see where Beck will fly off from there. I'll keep him waiting. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know some people are really coming down harshly on this album, but I think there are some levels of nuance in how it's framed and put together that I think are being missed. A lot of people are just getting caught up on the sound and saying, this is not for me, I don't like it, I'm getting away from it, where I think there's a bit more going on. So if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I am curious where the Beck fans will come down on this, given his varied discography, and I said some pretty controversial things opening up this review, so we'll see where that goes. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys are looking for other album reviews or the newest episodes of Billboard Breakdown, links in the card right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.